Hi folks, nice to see you all here today. As you may realise, I am flying solo. Unfortunately, my dear colleague and friend Anthony has had to leave because of a family emergency, so he sends his deepest regrets. If you do have specific clinical questions for him, please let me know afterwards, and I will endeavour to get in touch with him to explore those. We do, however, have a couple of colleagues in the audience who are clinicians, so who are waving their hands now. So if you have specific questions related to that, please ask them. My name's Hannah Storm. I know some of you already. This is a decade or so I've been coming to Perugia, and I just think it's probably one of the most extraordinary and exquisite places to have these really important conversations. Today we've only got 25 minutes, so I will rattle through, but I've been a journalist for the last 25 years, and for the last 10 years or so I've been working in mental health and journalism safety at the intersection of those, and trying to support colleagues around the world, ensure that they can do their jobs safely and well. We talk a lot about the sustainability of journalism, but I think we really need to be talking about the sustainability of journalism's most precious resource, its journalists. This piece of work I'm going to be sharing with you today, and I also invite you to come tomorrow morning. I wrote a book last year called, it's not a very sexy title, so I won't bore you with the title, but it's basically about journalism and mental health. We're going to explore some of the lessons we learned in writing the book tomorrow morning. We did a piece of research, Anthony and I, around the psychological toll of online harassment. As you may know, there is burgeoning data around the world into the impact of online harassment on journalists and the journalism community. Much has been done and said and kind of revealed in that space. We know that online harassment is a significant problem. And there's been some data and research done as well about the fact it has an emotional toll on journalists. But to date, there's nothing that's really been done in terms of what does that emotional toll entail? What type of psychological impact is this having on our journalism community? So I'm going to talk you through some of the data that we found in the research that we carried out. So this is a kind of broad brush approach of the countries that have done research on online harassment. You'll see that it's specifically related to certain parts of the world. And I think that, one of the messages from this is actually it would be great to get more research and more data around how online harassment is impacting journalists. Specifically, the report and data that I'm going to talk you through now relates to this data set. We worked with 246 Canadian journalists. The data was collected in an online website that was developed specifically for the study. It was password protected and encrypted, and we looked at demographic data, the nature of the harassment, and specific symptoms related to mental health concerns. And you can see those there. And we used clinically adopted scales, to help us ascertain what was impacting people and how people were impacted by this. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen there some of the data itself. So the kind of average median age of the people was 43 years old, and you can see kind of a breakdown there in terms of the kind of sex, the gender, and the kind of other demographics of people. On average, people have been working for 18.6 years as journalists, and you'll see there in the list of the demographics that just under half of the people we spoke with were reporters. So moving on, I'm going to kind of give you a synopsis towards the end of the kind of key takeaways. So you don't need to kind of write down all this data and kind of go, oh my goodness, I'm missing out. These are different platforms. So this data is pre and around Musk's takeover of Twitter. So the kind of dating is obviously whenever you have data, it's not immediate data, so it's a little while ago, but not so far back. But it looks specifically at the ways in which people were harassed, the platforms on which people were harassed, which you can see there, those quite stark figures. And you can see also the frequency of harassment. So many of you will be familiar with other types of research that's been done in this space, research that's been done by the IWMF, the research that's been done by people like Julie Passetti that says that, a lot of people deal with online harassment daily. Maria Ressa, for instance, who's here at the conference as well, deal daily. what we learned was these stats here, so that people were mainly receiving harassment weekly, but there were also some people receiving it daily and monthly as well. And I think just to step back from this kind of current research, we see this data and it's a lot of figures, right? And sometimes we lose sight of the people behind those figures. And I think the really important thing to acknowledge here is a lot of people receive online harassment. And unfortunately, a lot of journalism leaders assume that that has to be part of the journalist's job. It's kind of like, well, just suck it up. It becomes part of your job and then you have to just get on with it. And I think this is where, the work that Anthony and I are doing and a number of other people are doing to try to help people normalize the conversations that actually this is not normal. This should not be normal. This is abnormal. This is people attacking us as journalists for doing the job and the work that we do. Let's move on to the types of harassment. You can see that for yourself, but it's pretty stark when I read through that list. Threats of physical harm, vulgar or sexualized threats, death threats, threats against family. We know that a lot of the time this online harassment doesn't just stay with the individual themselves. It's, I know where your kid goes to school. It's, I know what your, I'm going to kill your dog. It's, I know where your mum and dad live. It's that kind of stuff. And I think the other thing that's really important to note is, as you'll have seen at the start of the slide, we call this "there's nothing virtual about online harassment." We know starkly, other research shows us there is a close correlation between online harassment and physical violence. It only takes kind of mention of people like Gary Lankesh, Daphne Caruana Galizia, to know the impacts that online harassment can have. People get murdered because of this. People get murdered doing their journalism when the threats start online. It's not always the case, but it is definitely a situation that we see. And that idea of personal image manipulation as well. We've seen wonderful people who have come to this conference in the last few years. Rana Ayub, for instance, the Indian journalist, Khadija Ismailova, people who have had their personal images manipulated to show things online which are completely and utterly disgusting, quite frankly, for them. And then key point at the bottom, we'll come back to this as well, the perceived level of support from the specific news organisation that people were working for was 6 out of 10. And I mean, I'll leave that with you. You can think that that's kind of okay, or you could think that's awful, or you can think that actually, well, my organisation gives me 2 out of 10. So I'll leave that with you. So just talking in terms of the breakdown of the impact on people's mental health and well-being of this online harassment, we specifically kind of looked at anxiety. And so 31% of journalists impacted by online harassment were found within our research to have moderate to severe symptoms of anxiety. So that's 1 in 3, pretty much. Depression, it's not happy reading this, is it? But depression, 26% of journalists, so 1/4 of the journalists had moderate to severe symptoms of depression. And PTSD. And so I come as a journalist who's experienced PTSD myself from a number of different things related to the trauma I've been exposed to in my professional and personal life. And as many of you may also know, or some of you may also have the misfortune to know, it's not a nice thing, PTSD. It is completely treatable. I sit before you kind of as somebody who's recovered from PTSD, but it's really pretty grim. And actually, if you think about the kind of the prevalence in Canada, for instance, so we're talking about a research project that took place within Canada. So the prevalence, lifetime prevalence, that means if you get PTSD at some stage in your life, within the population in Canada is 6%. Okay? So if you look at these statistics here, you'll see that actually they're showing that there's quite a significant symptoms which are related to PTSD that people are experiencing. So by intrusion, we're talking about things like persistent, unwanted re-experiencing of traumatic events, things like that. Avoidance is when we try to avoid the source of that trauma. Negative thoughts there, we're thinking about things like people having distorted beliefs about themselves as well. So an interesting kind of set of data there as well. I want to move on to a field called moral injury. and some of you might be familiar with the term moral injury. So Anthony and I did the first research into the impact of moral injury on the journalism community about 8 years ago, I think, when we were working with journalists who had been covering the refugee crisis in Europe. And we found that journalists were impacted significantly and at risk significantly of moral injury. The definition, it's a complicated kind of concept, but the definition is the injury done to a person's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts. It's a long definition. You can finish reading it yourself. But ultimately, what we're saying here is actually journalists who are working online, journalists who incur and encounter online harassment are significantly exposed to moral injury. And I'm going to share with you in the next slide some of the consequences, because for me and Anthony, moral injury is one of the biggest concerns, I think, for the journalism community. We know, it's not currently a mental health diagnosis, but we know that if it's not treated and if it's not dealt with effectively, that it can lead to PTSD. But there are many ways of supporting people. A lot of it is around the sense of betrayal that people feel, either because of the bosses have betrayed them or something else about journalism has betrayed them. So let's have a little quick look at the consequences of moral injury identified in journalists. I mean, I guess you can read them yourself, but if we think about some of the situations more globally in the last 2 years or so, I think probably many of you will recognize that there is really, really significant polarization in a lot of news organizations at the moment. There's some really stressful and really difficult situations that people are dealing with. There's a lot of threat to journalism and to journalists as well. And so if we were to kind of transcribe some of that across, I don't think it's any wonder that journalists who encounter online harassment are at risk of moral injury. So my work has lost some of its meaning and value. Number one, life has lost its meaning or purpose. I feel alienated from my profession. I was less trusting of others. I felt demoralized. I doubted my spirituality. Online responses to my work changed my perspective on a story. As an aside, other research has shown us that one of the most significant impacts of online harassment is people self-censor. So actually people stop doing the work that's really, really important for them to do. They stop doing that work and they move on to something else as well. So this is probably the more kind of nitty-gritty of this. What does this data tell us? Because it's a lot of information, as I said, I've just thrown at you. This data shows us that the frequency of threats, so the amount of times that people were threatened, so remember the bit I showed you about daily, weekly, correlated significantly with anxiety, depression, and moral injury. So in layman's terms, I guess what that means is you're threatened more online, you're more likely to experience those things. Now, global data does tell us that women in general are more at risk of online harassment, harassed more frequently than men. However, this data specifically, our data set, did not show that to be the case. Women were not harassed more than men in this data, but they were significantly more anxious and depressed than men and had higher PTSD and moral injury scores. Well, I don't know exactly why that is, and so I could come up with a bazillion reasons for you as to why that might be, but I don't have the clinical data around that. I do know that women who are harassed online, the harassment tends to become more sexualized. And so therefore, I would ask myself a question of, is it something to do with that potentially? Journalists who belong to, the Canadian term is the 2S LGBTQ, and you'll have perhaps different countries have different phrases for that. They were more anxious than their colleagues. Moral injury correlated significantly with anxiety, depression, and PTSD scores. And you can read the rest there. But the key thing I think I want to mention about moral injury is the emotions that were experienced and shown to be the case in the data were anger, shame, and disgust, and guilt. So people feeling guilt and anger because of what happened to them. So the overall psychological health picture is not that happy, as you can see. So the slightly paler colour is the journalists who presented in the data as showing signs that they were psychologically unwell. And the other bit is the, have I got that wrong way around? No, I've got it the other way. It's slightly happier than I'd said, sorry. Psychologically well. So fortunately, a number of journalists are psychologically well. I'm missing my clinician colleague, as you can tell. And the other part is psychologically well and unwell. So the point of the matter is, despite the fact that that picture is actually more positive, as in there's more people, more journalists who are psychologically well, it's still a pretty substantial percentage of people who are impacted emotionally and psychologically by this. Fortunately, journalists where the news organisations offered psychological support and therapy in response to the harassment were less depressed and had lower moral injury and PTSD scores. So that, to me, says that actually those journalists who experience online harassment, if they get the help, then actually that is a positive thing as well, right? So I will leave you with a final slide, and then I'm very happy to take questions about this. Here are our takeaways. So online harassment, as we discussed, or I've mentioned already, is common. Approximately a quarter of the journalists who experience it struggle psychologically with it. An emotional distress is strongly associated with moral injury. Support and therapy are helpful. And moral injury comes with real-world consequences. So I'm going to leave it there. I feel like I've done a very quick whiz through, but I'm very happy to take questions or comments. In the spirit of not having huge amounts of time, please keep your comments, questions brief. And I would also be grateful if you could remember, this is not a therapy session, so please be cautious in terms of what you do choose to share with us. Anybody got any questions?
Thank you very much, and I wouldn't have missed this for the world. So I do some research on this, but Africans and investigative journalists. And what I've noticed is there are differences between the type of media. So radio journalists actually get more physical harm while they're in the studio, and they get threats through Facebook because they are streaming to get revenue. So I wanted to ask you, did you see differences in journalism type? I'm particularly interested in what you noticed about the photographers and video journalists. Anything you can share more on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me take another question, and then I'll probably take a couple of questions. Did anybody else have another question? Or is that... No? Oh, yes, please, thank you.
Just shortly, is there a way to protect ourselves? Did you reconsider that, maybe?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So on this slide here, you can see the breakdown in terms of the roles that people played and the work that they specifically did. We didn't go into the specific breakdown in terms of do reporters, radio reporters, for instance, who are interacting with people on Meta or Facebook experience more abuse. I do know, anecdotally, not from this study itself, that when people are doing things like live streaming and when people are working through that space, it does expose them significantly to those situations. You know, for the last number of, 10 years I've been coming to Perugia, we've been having conversations about online harassment and how the platforms ought to play a role. And unfortunately, that's never really... it's not really ever been kind of responded to in a kind of adequate way. On the protection mechanism, so there's a huge amount of stuff that can be done protectively. And I think one of the things that I find from the journalism, safety and mental health work I do is where organizations invest proactively in these conversations, that can make a huge difference. So both, I mean, I can go into a lot more detail, but I would actually invite you to look into some of the work that people like Julie Passetti do, because Julie Passetti has done some fantastic work in terms of the protective work that we can do. I think one of the most protective things we can do is recognizing it's happening, having news leaders in our organizations recognizing that this is happening. Because if it's constantly shoved to one side, unfortunately as it is, and as other issues such as vicarious trauma are also shoved to one side, then actually we're not acknowledging that this is something which is awful and should be abnormal, but it's actually happening on a daily basis. From a protective mechanism, there's kind of technically, there's lots of things that can be done to protect our digital profiles as well. There are other workshops that have been kind of shared in that space, so I won't go into that information right now. But then I think also just from a solidarity perspective, a lot of the time people feel incredible shame when they experience this kind of harassment. They kind of think, oh my God, and we saw the guilt and shame there in the study. They feel embarrassed. They think, oh, maybe I'm a failure as a journalist, or maybe I'm not doing my job correctly, because actually this harassment tells us that we're bad. It's a messenger telling us that we're doing stuff bad, but actually that messenger wants to close down the journalist, right? The journalist's not doing anything bad. In fact, the journalist needs to really keep on doing their job if they possibly can, feel supported to do that. So one of the really strong things we can do is, where we feel safe to do so, is speak about it and share our experiences and kind of work with our news leaders to try to build that solidarity. There's a number of organisations around the world who are kind of coming together in solidarity to try to support folks who are dealing with online harassment as well. Does anybody else have any other specific? Yeah, two more. Well, take the person at the back with the blue top. Thank you.
What's the type of help provided by journalistic institutions, if they provide help? And also, can they encourage journalists that are tackled by harassment to speak about it on their platforms, or is it like not recommended if they wish to?
No, thank you. So there's a whole vast range of help that is often offered. You know, your two colleagues sitting in the row in front of you work with an employee assistance program. So there's a lot of organisations that actually bring in employee assistance programs to provide therapy and support and other resources, which I think is fantastic. A lot of organisations may not have that capacity to bring that in, but I think one of the key things is acknowledging it's happening, is leaders leading by example and actually saying, we don't want you to tolerate this. We're going to bring in education which helps us realise it's happening, and we're going to bring in tools and resources to help us protect ourselves as well. Ultimately, I think the response conversation has to come down to a really strong relationship between the journalist who's impacted and the news leader themselves, because historically we used to say, you know, don't feed the beast. So we used to say, don't respond, okay? And then the conversation changed slightly, because actually people realized that that's silencing the journalist even more. So I think ultimately it has to be a kind of risk assessment that takes place in terms of, if I respond, what does that look like? Is that going to actually further inflame and incite anger in the situation? A really positive thing that's been done in a couple of organisations is, so for instance, Reach PLC in the UK has something that's called a hive. So what happens is sometimes they have a number of people who are already pre-ascertained who can support the person who's being impacted. So they might jump in and say really positive stuff online, for instance. So that's one thing that can be done as well. And then there are other things in terms of just recognizing, you know, is it actually helpful for that journalist to respond? Just because you choose not to respond doesn't mean that you have other ways of kind of talking about it and dealing with it, I think. So that's helpful to say as well. Let's take one more question, because I'm conscious we have 3 minutes left, and hopefully there's a lady at the back, and hopefully I'll be able to come to you if we can. Otherwise, you can ask me afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I'm a student in journalism, and we're talking a lot right now about what happened and what's happening. But is there a way of preventing of it happening?
So preventing it happening? Did you say?
Yeah. I know that is not the fault of the journalist, but is there something in like actions or organizations that can, or other measurements that we can see that helps preventing that this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably an entire other workshop or conversation panel, but I think that there's at different levels. So there are different levels, for instance, at policy levels at government. There are international conversations taking place within the UK, kind of within the EU, in the States, in Canada, about kind of what policies can be done. There are conversations taking place between government and regulators and platforms. But I think one of the things that actually is really helpful in terms of preventing it is, this is not necessarily prevention, but one of the things we find from research is actually when journalists remember what their purpose is and what their mission is, it can be incredibly protective to people's mental health. We're doing this for a reason. It's horrible. It was really horrible. But actually, when we can join together and realize that actually there's a reason people are trying to attack us, because they're trying to silence something which is really powerful and really important. So I think if you can buy into that idea of actually we need to try to keep on doing this brilliant journalism. Obviously, we need to take breaks from it. It's really important to preserve our mental health, but actually the purpose and the mission can be incredibly protective for our well-being as well. I don't necessarily think that's the specific answer that you're looking for, but there's an element of that preventive stuff that I've talked about, and then also the kind of the aftercare as well. I'm going to finish it up there. I do appreciate you sitting through this and giving me your time. And again, thanks ever so much for being here, and apologies again from Anthony.